Aloha mai kako, or greetings everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here as part of this conversation. Professor David Theo Goldberg had invited me over email, and I'm not too sure if at the time he recognized my name because I used to work at Arizona State from 1999 to 2006. It's an honor to be here at the East-West Center, but truthfully, I'm a little terrified to be in front of you because I'm more familiar with the University of California's Humanities Research Institute in the 1990s, when I was a graduate student at UC Irvine's History Department. I remember talks by the likes of Jean-Francois Lyotard and Edward Said, and I once attended what was billed as a special conversation between Derrida and Spivak that I have to admit I did not fully understand at the moment, and probably wouldn't today. But anyway, hopefully in this conversation, we'll get to talk about a number of things. I'm well aware of the fact that people come to Hawaii with a lot of questions, and once they get here, they have even more, and even when they leave, they have even more. So if you are a drinking person, this is kind of like a shot, or if you don't drink but have caffeine, this is like an espresso shot. There's only so much that we can do in my 25-minute presentation and the hour we have together before you head to the bus and go back to Waikiki. My conversation with you will not be as stellar as the Derrida and Spivak one, about 15 or 20 years ago, but through it I hope to accomplish two things, two SLOs, or student learning outcomes, if you happen to use assessment language that is all the rage among some administrators, I think you know. First, as a professional academic historian, I will tell you a little bit about this place, Hawaii, but more specifically, I will stick to the area of Oahu I am most familiar with in Honolulu, the Ahupua'a, or land unit that runs from Manoa in the Mauka area, and I'm a little turned around, I think the mountains are this way. Where we are now, we're in Manoa Valley, at the East-West Center and the University of Hawaii, all the way Makai or seaward to Waikiki where you're staying. Secondly, since I've been asked to share with you some of my work, I will also draw attention to some of the modes of communicating the histories in Hawaii. As you might have already noticed, Hawaii is a place where communication styles are a little bit different from other places. In talking story to you, I will delve a bit into the overlap of academic studies, public histories, Native Hawaiian mo'olelo, and what I call local stories. Academic studies are the ones that I participate in at the University of Hawaii. Public histories are ones that I converse in as an advisor to the Bishop Museum and also the Hawaiian Historical Society, which, although started by annexationists over 110 years ago, has taken a change, I hope, for the better in the past 20 years. Native Hawaiian mo'olelo, increasingly, which are being revitalized as they're being digitized and read through digital projects like Ulukau, a font of knowledge for Native Hawaiian language readers. And for local stories, for people who've been here 10, 20, 30 years, or 10 or 20, 30 generations. So in local fashion, let's get going. Or as one might say in Hawaii Creole, or Pidgin, "E come, we go." Or in Olelo Hawaii, I mean Hawaiian, we would say, "E huaka'i ana kākou." Let's go on a field trip, Ike Manava, at this time. I grew up not too far from here on Monolani Heights, which is the second ridge over from this one, which is called St. Louis Heights at the moment, with my grandparents. My grandfather, from the Paniolo, or ranch country of Waimea on the Big Island, met my grandmother here on Oahu at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the late 1930s. Neither graduated, however, due to a thing called World War II that brought a civil service job for my grandmother with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at makeshift offices that had been commandeered away from Punahou School, Barack Obama's alma mater, which was founded in 1841 by missionary families, just 1 mile about Eva from here. After December 1941, my grandfather had military duties at Fort Kamehameha at the entrance of Pearl Harbor. Anyway, that was the 1940s, and my mother, also a University of Hawaii graduate, was born in 1944, the first of 8 children. Let's flash forward to the 1970s when I was living with them and my mother as a single mother and my extended ohana or family. Back then, my grandpa would take out his Navy surplus binoculars and we would look out our bay window onto the ocean past Leahi, more commonly known as Diamond Head. The easiest things to spot were the Matson ships, traveling to and from the mainland with a capital M. I knew that much of our food and other goods came from someplace far away, and since then I've spent much of my personal and professional life in various ways thinking about issues of place and distance. How was my home of Hawaii, and how is my home of Hawaii related to these places abroad? Like a lot of other folks from the islands, I thought about these issues of place and distance more often once I moved away. First from my undergraduate years in the American Midwest at Northwestern University, then to graduate school at UCHRI, then my first 2 jobs in academia in Asian, Pacific, American Studies programs at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles near LAX, a very, very popular school among local folks from Hawaii, and Arizona State University, the mega university in Tempe, Arizona. At both locales, I had been hired to teach so-called Asian American Studies, but I had been specifically hired also to incorporate Pacific Islander experience curricula that I had first started developing as a doctoral candidate at UC Irvine. At Arizona State, as well as Loyola Marymount and even at Irvine, Native Hawaiians, local Hawaii expatriates, and other islanders with families from both Samoas, Tonga, Guam, Saipan, the Marshalls, and Palau trickled into my classes. Like Rona Halualani, I'm going to back up. Like Rona Halualani, a communication scholar of Hawaiian ancestry, trained at ASU by Professor Goldberg, among others, I also lived and worked with the Pacific Islander communities in metropolitan Phoenix. Some of that experience from 1999 to 2006 is found in the AAPI Nexus special issue on art and cultural institutions, edited by Franklin Odo and Paul Ong, that Conrad Ng mentioned just on Friday. I was putting this thing together in the last few days, basically taking key off of what I saw from Conrad Ng, one of my colleagues and friends since the 90s. And I must admit, it's kind of hard and terrifying to speak after him, and also at the end of a long day when I know people want to go home and experience things in Waikiki. But hopefully the things that I'll tell you today will kind of inform that experience. Maybe you can ask me some questions or other people questions and come back later. Sometimes I'll lapse into informal speaking styles. I think part of it is because I haven't moved around that much, but as I told you just briefly biographically, moving between here and the continental US, at the very least, does take a little bit of code switching, as some communication scholars would say. Also, coming back to Hawaii, I've also decided to do things a little bit differently. Just last year, for example, Craig Howes and Jonathan Kamakavivo-Oli Osorio started a project which they had envisioned while running in the valleys of Palolo Valley and Manoa, just here. With the elections coming up in 2010, last year, they quickly got about 29 of us to write topical essays on a variety of different issues facing Hawaii. The result was a book called The Value of Hawaii, Knowing the Past, Shaping the Future. I wrote the chapter on race and ethnicity in Hawaii. Other people wrote on Hawaiian issues, homelessness, prisons, agriculture, labor, and so on and so forth. Gay Chan, who's the chair of the Art and Art History department here, also contributed the cover, and I'm not too sure if you can see it quite clearly, but even the Nihon University Japanese students on Monday that I lectured to could notice this. On the left side, and this is a photo from the late 50s, early 60s, you can see a man with or a boy, about a 5 or 6 year old boy with a cowboy hat, holding a silhouette of, does anybody know who that might be or guess? I'll give you a hint. There's a statue downtown like this. Kamehameha. So Kamehameha Paea. The Japanese students weren't able to get that, but they definitely got the one on the right, and that is George Washington. Okay. Gay Chan and other people like myself readily identify with this portrait that has been redone and recovered from the Bishop Museum and overlaid with different kinds of media. It's a way to express what it means for some people to grow up in Hawaii, pledging allegiance in some ways to Kamehameha and the history of Hawaii, but also George Washington, which shows up on each and every dollar, right? So there's kind of a little bit of a disconnect, to say the least, when growing up in Hawaii, whether it's the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, and so on. The Asian American Pacific Islander nexus issue that was made reference to is, by Conrad, is about art and cultural institutions, which, as you know, public history areas, museums, as Benedict Anderson tells us, the census, for example, kind of reify who people are to other people who are at a distance. So if you want to take a look at what some of the things that Conrad was mentioning, what it means for Asian Americans, for example, I have a lesser known article in there about Pacific Islanders in, of all places, the Phoenix metropolitan area trying to represent themselves in a number of different ways. Sometimes alongside Native American communities at the world-renowned Hearst Museum, other times at cultural festivals like the Matsuri. Matsuri is a word for festival, but there's a Matsuri festival, which is kind of redundant. But very, very frequently, Native Hawaiians and others are presenting their culture at specific times during the year, during various popular festivals, since they don't necessarily have a physical ethnic enclave. And for the past now 15 years, the very popular Pacific Islander Festival, which over the course of a 2-day weekend in March, sees over 70,000 Pacific Islanders from the Phoenix metropolitan area and nearby Utah, Nevada, and California, as well as the Pacific. Okay. The work that I mentioned, or the scholar that I mentioned before, is Rona Halualani. She has a book at University of Minnesota Press called In the Name of Hawaiians. I kind of felt inspired to do all this grabbing and putting it into keynote presentations after seeing Conrad's presentation. In the summer of 2006, I had a brief chance to get back to Hawaii. I had been tired of traveling the Phoenix-Honolulu route for research here and there, to do research, ongoing research here in Honolulu, and to see my family and that of my wife. My wife, the print journalist Jolene Okimoto of the Associated Press, also from Honolulu, and more specifically from Manoa Valley, really wanted to return home, especially after the birth of our first child, a girl whom we wanted to raise in the islands like ourselves. So with little thinking, I left my job and quickly accepted a job teaching at Kamehameha Schools, Kapa'alama, a school for Native Hawaiians that has been set up in honor of Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop in the 1880s, a granddaughter of King Kamehameha the Great, and also the heir to the largest private land estate in Hawaii, which in 2006 had a value of over $9 billion. Needless to say, I knew that this employer could move me and my family. Growing up in Hawaii, I also knew that unless I worked for the so-called Big Five, there would be little chance, if any, to come to Hawaii on the company dollar. I also knew that if I waited for an academic position, it might be 5, 10, 15 years, or maybe never, and my children would grow older and not know the Hawaii experience. Having left Honolulu some 20 years ago, except for some family trips in 1986, when I graduated from high school, there was a lot of adjusting going on, even though I had spent a lot of time here visiting family and doing my research and so on and so forth. To tell you the truth, it wasn't that difficult to leave Arizona, or Arizona State specifically, and we can talk about that later over drinks. But I had to do 2 things upon coming here in 2006. First of which was readjusting to life in Hawaii. There was a little bit of a cultural adjustment, even though my wife and I had been here and grown up here, and our families have been here for generations. But secondly, I also, as a teacher, had to learn how new generations of youngsters in Hawaii, and more specifically Native Hawaiian children, were learning via multimedia, the internet, and also with an entirely different set of popular cultural references than I had. To make a long story short, my experience there at Kamehameha Schools, Kapa'alama, is anybody familiar with the school? I've heard of the school before. It's often in the national news. It has a Native Hawaiians only preference and is nearly free for all children who go there. So it's the subject of a lot of lawsuits. But the way I summarize my experience to a lot of colleagues and friends is that my experience there at Kamehameha Schools was exciting, exhilarating, and exhausting. Waking up every morning at 4:30 in the morning to try to squeeze in my own work, opening up my classroom at 7:15, and then teaching a cushy 4 classes a day as opposed to the 5 or 6 classes a day that my public school colleagues in the Department of Education did. During my 2 years at Kamehameha, I learned much more from my students than they probably did from me, their AP, or Advanced Placement U.S. History teacher, who was trying to help them achieve scores of 5s on their AP U.S. History exams. I had the opportunity to brush up on Hawaiian and Olelo Hawaii, which is the proper term for the Hawaiian language. And I learned various contemporary words and protocols that had developed since the Hawaiian language immersion projects of the 1980s and Hawaiian culture charter schools of the 1990s, things I had missed when I was away for undergraduate and grad schools. One of the best things a student ever told me came from Konoi Elvenia, who was actually a well-known orator for the class, her junior class, and also a hula practitioner in the halau that my next-door neighbor, Kaleo Trinidad, was lead of. She told me not to be, quote, a book Hawaiian. In other words, learning from books and former curricula was good, but to use her words, you gotta live the culture, putting it into practice in your everyday language and your lekawila, or your emails. And these days we would say tweets, but Twitter wasn't around in 2006. Anyway, I've spent about 10 minutes here talking about some of these autobiographical experiences as a way to relate some of Hawaii's history to you. I've also glanced a little bit at your schedule and see that you have lightning papers. So in reference to lightning-like conversation, I'll skip ahead to tell you that after 2 years at teaching at Kamehameha Schools, I was extremely lucky to use the words of a friend. The gods looked down upon me. There was a newly created job in the history of modern Hawaii by the state legislature after years of protests by student organizations and community organizations. It opened, I applied, I got the job, and I certainly accepted, preferring teaching university. I often run into my Kamehameha School students right here on campus, and the way I try to explain to it, they feel very betrayed. As I said, you know, you went to Kamehameha, you're at University of Hawaii, you love Kamehameha, which do you like better, high school or college? Oh, I got it, Dr. Rosa. Anyway, so it's time to move on. Anyway, moving on, I restarted my book project, this time working more organically. And being a historian of Hawaii in Hawaii, at the University of Hawaii, its main campus in Manoa, I knew bore more responsibility than other kinds of positions. I asked myself continually how my research, teaching, and community service worked together, something not necessarily out of the ordinary for many people. But I also knew that here in Honolulu, and more specifically in the area from Manoa to Waikiki, I was likely to run into extended family, neighbors, and community members at Long's drugstore, at the beach, at fundraisers, at my daughter's soccer practice at playgrounds, where I would be asked and held accountable for a number of different things. For my participation in some community activities and not others, for my willingness to speak out at some events and not others, and definitely what I published, maybe not in academic journals, but what was excerpted in the Honolulu Weekly and what is now the Star Advertiser. Genealogies, family histories, and this is no joke, even where one attended school, high school, are very highly important. If you really must know, and this is actually at the end of my official bio on the History Department webpage, I graduated from Damien Memorial High School in the rough and tough neighborhood of Kalihipalama, just below Kamehameha Schools. It's an all-boys Catholic school, and if you really need to know the year, I graduated in 1986. To give you a sense of what it means to teach and do research and talk to community groups about history, I will tell you a little bit about what I've been focusing on for more than 15 years, about a historical event called the Massey Affair case of 1931-32. Okay. And this is going to take some time. In general, I've been giving this talk for a long, long time. It usually takes about 50 minutes. You're going to get the 2-minute version. Has anybody heard of the Massey Kamehameha case, just by a show of hands? Okay. Anyway, it's a way for me to talk about the nature of history and how history, you know, often back in the day when I would travel on airplanes, people would say, oh, what are you studying? History? And they say, oh, I was never good in history. I was never good at names and dates. But I would try to convince them, no, when you study history at the college level and even teach it, it's very, very different. Here in Hawaii, it also starts from home, as George Lipsitz would say, ethnic studies scholar at UC Santa Barbara now, with the local, the immediate, and the personal. We talk story about relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances, including my grandmother, who's in the far right, part of a large Chinese-American family. In the center is Auntie Tomi, and I would often stop off at Auntie Tomi's house because Auntie Tomi and her husband actually inhabit the house of my great-grandparents, whom I knew really, really well until they passed away when I was 20 years old. Auntie Tomi used to watch Japanese language soap operas in Japanese language, and in 1995, when I was doing my dissertation research, I thought, oh my goodness, my family is Chinese and Auntie Tomi is Japanese. And it suddenly dawned on me, I'm part of a multi-ethnic family, right? There's a layering of history that I didn't know. Furthermore, I didn't know that her family back in California, a Japanese-American family, had been interned. She was away at school, so she was only brought back and interned briefly, but because she had excellent Japanese and English language skills, she was sent to Washington, D.C., where she taught Japanese to MIS, or military intelligence personnel, during World War II, many of whom later became very prominent Asia scholars. So to make a long story short, to say it in local fashion, I know shame, right? I show you pictures of my relatives to tell you how things are interrelated. And I could tell you a little story about each of them, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. To make a long story short, there are a variety of different kinds of history that I think you're well aware of, but when we work in academic circles, we don't always acknowledge it too quickly. There are personal and family histories, community histories, and local and regional histories. And part of my, my academic career is actually talking about how these histories are very important to people in everyday life, and how they intersect with the national and global histories that we often hear from textbooks and in academic conferences. Public history, I think, as you know, in the last 20 or so years has been revamped in the interest of garnering more and more audiences in exciting ways. It's no longer the static kind of museum presentations that you had before. And only lastly do you have academia, which is for a select few at times, depending on the kind of media that you publish in. I think a lot of you are aware of analytical categories like race, class, gender, and place that can be used in talking about histories. This is actually part of a larger presentation that I usually give, and I'm just borrowing slides. But to take a look at the history and mo'olelo of the islands, I think a lot of you from guidebooks know that there are 8 major islands, and we're here on Oahu. But when we start narrating the history of Hawaii, we have to think about what things are to be included and excluded, right? Even the islands themselves, there are over 107 islands, geographically speaking, but we only usually talk about 8, and realistically only about 3 or 4. There are a variety of different histories that are oral, written, and even performed through hula, for example. There are also historically significant sites and material culture that you would see at Bishop Museum, or even next door in a heiau or temple that's been overrun. I won't go into this, but in my larger classes on the history of Hawaii at the underclassmen level, we talk a little bit about the migration theories and various migration theories. I think by now most people know that there were deliberate voyages throughout the Pacific. We're not in the days of Thor Heyerdahl and Andrew Sharp talking about the hapless voyagers drifting from South America. I also use a brief chronology, and I won't go over this, but to say the very least, archaeological evidence shows that we do have humans arriving here. Patrick Kirch of UC Berkeley says at least by 400 CE, if not earlier. We have a rise in the population around 1100, which causes the large population to develop different kinds of chief leaf systems. And for purposes of discussion here, We only have significant and sustained Western contact after the arrival of James Cook, who's on a special mission to seek out new life and new civilizations and to boldly go where no one has gone before. Okay? So how many of you knew that Captain James Cook was actually on a scientific expedition? Okay. And you do know that Gene Roddenberry, I'm not a Star Trek person, but it's okay if you are. Gene Roddenberry bases James T. Kirk on James Cook. James Cook has the prime directive, to observe but not to interact. James Cook did the same thing, and he instructed his crew members not to interact with the local population. Anyway, I digress. It's pretty cool in a regular class setting. To make a long story short, interaction with the West is only about some 200 years ago. So in terms of making a move from a self-subsistence economy to a planter capitalist society to a highly consumer capitalist society, Hawaii undergoes drastic change very, very quickly. So that's what I wanted to achieve. And I think some of you know there's a thing called the Spanish-American-Cuban-Philippine War in 1898. And it's as a result of that, well after the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893, that Hawaii gets closer and closer tied into relationship with the United States. Okay, the Massey case that I'm going to tell you about is only about 30 years after Hawaii is formally a territory of the United States. What exactly happened in this case? Well, oops. Thalia Massey, who's roughly the age of a lot of my undergraduates, a 20-year-old white woman from the East Coast, is the wife of a 26-year-old naval officer stationed at Pearl Harbor, and she's allegedly raped by 5 non-white local young men. Her husband works at Pearl Harbor. They actually live here in Manoa Valley in a house that still exists, actually about 100 meters away from the church where I got married. It's also a house that still stands today, and Lois Yamauchi, who is a professor of education, actually lives in the house. So there are actual physical reminders of this house. She's allegedly raped by 5 non-white local young men, and in 1931-32, this crossing of the barrier between white and non-whites was cause for concern. The men who were accused in the top left were Joseph Kahahavai, a native Hawaiian, and to his right, Ben Ahakuelo, and to the bottom, Horace Ida, Japanese, and to his right, David Takai, also of Japanese ancestry. In the top right is Henry Chang, and I usually do this with my students. Chang, I think a lot of you know, is very often Chinese. He's also part Native Hawaiian, and it's very much cause for concern during US coverage and global coverage of this well-known case from 1931-32. There's a lot of talk about mongrels and people of mixed race running amok, for example, in territorial Hawaii. Basic events of the case, and again, if you're confused, don't worry. There's a made-for-TV miniseries video on this from the 80s. There's also an American Experience documentary from 2005 that David Stannard and myself were consultants on. It's kind of confusing, but initially there's a rape of Thalia Massey in September of 1931 that allegedly took place near the Hilton Hawaiian Village. The young men that I just showed you, who are in their early 20s, are rounded up. They're actually enjoying a night out at an outdoor dance at the Waikiki Amusement Area, which is actually where the current site of the Hawaii Convention Center is, which is going to be the home of the APEC conference in November. Because there's not enough evidence to place the individuals there at the time, the Ala Moana assault trial in the fall of 1931 ends in a mistrial. And I won't get into the details, but to make a long story short, there are factions within the Honolulu Police Department. It's a largely white-administered police department with Native Hawaiian officers. The boys are very convenient because they are rounded up in a near fight near the Honolulu Art Academy of Arts. There have been over 7 scholars, including myself, that looked at the evidence, which is still at the state archives and other places. There was not necessarily time or opportunity for these individuals. Having said that, in my book, I do take the claim of rape by Thalia Massey very, very serious. It's not 100% positive by physical evidence if she was raped, but she was definitely physically assaulted, but not by the individuals that we showed. Nevertheless, Thalia Massey's family and the US Navy is very, very upset about this. What they do is they take the darkest of the group, the Native Hawaiian Joseph Kahahawai, in January of 1932. Thalia Massey's husband, mother, and 2 naval midshipmen who are hired as hitmen actually kidnap him, take him to a room in Manoa Valley at a house that still exists, and I pass by every day. When he doesn't confess to the rape of Thalia Massey, they shoot him, and they think it's a great idea to take the body and wrap it up and try to rush it all the way down Waialae Avenue to Hanauma Bay, past Hanauma Bay to the blowhole, where they're caught red-handed. So this is a very sensationalized case, to say the least. Hawaii at the time is a territory of the US with a governor appointed by the president. It has a non-voting delegate to Congress. It doesn't have much power. And many territorial residents are actually US citizens by being born in the US territory of Hawaii, mainly whites and Native Hawaiians and second-generation Asian children. Keep in mind that I think a lot of you know that Asians, first-generation Asians, during this time are aliens ineligible for citizenship. As a result of this case, there are federal reports from the Department of the Interior. This is a kind of an extended brochure that's about 130 pages long by the Department of the Interior with a fancy title called Hawaii and Its Race Problem, trying to reassure people that white people are still safe in Hawaii. And Hawaii, in case you don't know, is in the middle of the Pacific, right? Because aside from coverage in the 1890s briefly here in the New York Times and Washington Post, which not everybody read, not too many people are exactly sure where Hawaii is. In terms of the population, even if you take a conservative estimate of about 250 to 400,000 Native Hawaiians, like other indigenous groups, you see rapid decline as a result of lack of immunity to a variety of diseases, even fairly commonplace ones like measles, whooping cough, and so on and so forth. So much so that by the 1850s, we have a record low of 73,000 Native Hawaiians. It's only in the mid-19th century that we start to have the importation of laborers, mostly from East Asia, to work on what? What do you think? Plantations, right? And specifically, they're going to work on sugar plantations. Initially, Chinese and Portuguese are used, but by the late 19th century, early 20th century, the largest populations are Japanese, and you can kind of see it in this publication from the 1920s. This Emin Center is actually named after the first large official group of Japanese to come to Hawaii under a special agreement with the Kingdom of Hawaii under Kalakaua administration. So usually I use this historic graph or some variation thereof to talk about Native Hawaiian decline and the rise of laboring groups of people that make up multicultural Hawaii, largely East Asian from China and Japan, also Portugal and Puerto Ricans and Filipinos. Okay. In terms of news, there's a sharp division between working class locals, children of plantation workers, their children and grandchildren. Very often you have a facility with English, but not always a reading ability at times. This is a large gathering where the Japanese community, for example, is having the news of an event read to them at a community center. The funeral of Joseph Kahahawai, for example, is also one that working class people attended. This is actually from the same era. It's from Mo'iliili, not too far from here, a largely Japanese-American community in the 1930s. And if you can see, the street is dirt, and you have people who are barefoot here watching the funeral procession go by. Here in urban Honolulu, and this is what I do in my book, I talk about the different areas. I'm not too sure if you can see right here. This is residential Manoa. It's in the same Ahupua that goes all the way to Waikiki. The boys who are accused of raping Thalia Massey are from the working class area just beyond downtown of Kalihi Palama. where Damien High School is, where I went to school, and also up the street where I taught at Kamehameha Schools. It's about here. The distance between these two areas, Manoa and Kalihi-Palama, is not that far. I don't know if you can tell, but I used to run cross country. And we would run about 2.5 miles from the all-boys school of Damien to Punahou School. And if you haven't been to Punahou School, it has lots and lots of nice things, including ice-cold water fountains. And we would drink the water there and then run back. Anyway, to make a long story short, that's the little story I tell my students to say, you know, it's not that far a distance between wealthy and not so wealthy during early territorial Hawaii. This is actually from a book from Andrew Lind, a sociologist in the 1950s. Roughly the era when the East-West Center was getting off the ground, or going to get off the ground in 1961. This was probably taken at Varsity Theater, emphasizing Hawaii's multicultural character, multi-ethnic community. And if you can see in the center and top center, you also have some military personnel on occasion taking classes here at UH. Hawaii during the Cold War was often touted as a place where East meets West, and by 1961, home to the East-West Center, and so on and so forth. Kennedy was president, and unfortunately, he was assassinated in '63, and that's why we have JFK Theater across the way. My mother was in the quarry, which is now the parking lot area, smoking a cigarette and trying to study for a math exam and feeling so sorry about JFK. And I'm digressing here, but there's a reason I'm named John. Anyway, to make a long story short, he visited Hawaii, and a lot of people are very much into the Kennedy era. The 1950s and 1960s are when things are changing. The big five that I had mentioned, which are the planter and merchant elite, very often related to the missionaries, are featured here. Alexander and Baldwin, Castle and Cook, American Factors, Theo Davies, which is British, C. Brewer, and so on. You can't quite make it out here, but this is from a federal report in 1932. These are the boards of directors of these 5 companies, and on the outsides are actually the large plantation companies. And here and there are also the banking institutions and insurance agencies. When my mother, who used to work for Bank of Hawaii, saw this, she said, "Oh my God, you can really see how interconnected the old elite were in Hawaii." And it's no joke, and it's perfectly understandable to see how strike activities until the 1940s and 1950s were often squashed down as people were blacklisted. Also, in terms of the way in which the Department of the Interior and people in the continental US sometimes envisioned Hawaii, in that Hawaii and Its Race Problem book describing the history of Hawaii, even on 2 pages, and this is filled with about 70 some odd photos of Hawaii, you can see on the right a pineapple cannery. The caption, I don't know if you can make it out, says, "All descendants of coolies from somewhere." So in other words, these are workers, I'm not too sure where they are, and they're coolies, and you know, that's not necessarily politically correct. On the other hand, the white man's manner of life prevails, right? And on the side here on the left, it's actually not even men, it's women playing on a golf course here in Honolulu. So these are kind of the contrasts that I talk about. And interestingly enough, when I was flying back from Irvine to here and staying with my grandmother, the archives here close around 4:30, and I would come back home and my grandmother would prepare a meal, and we would talk, and she'd say, "Well, what did you learn? You know, or what did you research?" And I would tell her, and she, having been born in 1921, would tell me, "Oh, yeah, well, you know, sometimes there were certain beaches that I couldn't go to, for example," and so on and so forth. So if you talk and if you scratch lightly and ask generously enough, sometimes you get these stories. I'm going to speed along here in the interest of time. This was a highly publicized event, not publicized, covered event. The Associated Press for 1932 actually ranked it in the top 10 in terms of the most covered news stories for 1931-32. It also took the attention of the NAACP, and here's a letter of support by an officer in the NAACP, because this was the very same year that you had the Scottsboro trial, where 9 African-American men were on trial for allegedly raping 2 white women on a westbound train in Alabama. Native Hawaiian newspapers, and there were over a dozen of them in the 1890s, also covered the event, but by 1931-32 there were only 2 in existence. fewer and fewer people speaking Native Hawaiian. Kealaka'i o Hawaii, which was actually published here in Mo'i'ili, is asking at the very top, Pehea ihoi lana hana ia no ka poi hana kraima. How can there be justice for the people who perpetuated this crime? Oh, I forgot to mention, after Joseph Kahahavai is killed, there is a trial. I'm going to skip through a lot of this. A well-known defense attorney by the name of Clarence Darrow actually defends Thalia Massey's husband and mother and the two naval midshipmen. Despite Clarence Darrow's efforts, a local jury of people who work for the Big Five actually put their jobs on the line, and they convict the Massey group of the lesser charge of manslaughter. They're sentenced to 10 years hard labor at Oahu prison. But because Hawaii is a territory at the time, Lawrence Macaulay Judd can't seem to pardon them. So he to preserve his conscience, he commutes, or he shortens their sentence to 1 hour in his office. The governor's office then is at Iolani Palace. And within a few days, Thalia Massey and her husband and mother leave Hawaii so that they can't be further prosecuted. This is, to say the least, a very hurtful event in Hawaii. The commutation of the Massey Fortescue Group by Territorial Governor Lawrence Macaulay Judd was a hurtful event, and it's largely forgotten outside of Hawaii after the 1940s. The majority of my research in the past 10 years is talking about the ways in which people in Hawaii and elsewhere remember a case like this in different ways, in different moments in the past 75 to 80 years. There have been at least 3 true crime books who were published in the 1960s about these. Just a couple of scholarly analyses in the 1980s. A play that almost was produced in 1970, but then was threatened with a lawsuit, so it didn't come out until 2004. A made-for-TV miniseries with Chris Christopherson, Sean Young, Jose Ferrer, and Madeline Stowe. And finally, a documentary by the American Experience in WGBH Boston. So I know I'm going through these things really, really quickly. The Advertiser and the Star Bulletin, mostly in the 80s and the 90s, would occasionally have historical retrospectives where they would talk a little bit about this spectacular case. One of the reasons why I took a look at this case to begin with is I wanted to write some sort of dissertation on the study of race in Hawaii, because Hawaii was often touted as a laboratory for race relations. Every time I looked deeply, I came across this Massey case that I had never heard of. I'm born in 1968. My mother is born in 1944. My generation, my mother's generation, never heard about this. And for the most part, from about the 40s all the way up until the late 1980s, unless you were directly related or a very, very avid reader, you were not likely to hear too much about the Massey Kahahavai case. So much about my book is about the history of forgetting and remembering in Hawaii. The Navy played a role in this, so it's an excellent way to talk about the role of the military in Hawaii. And it's only in 2006, when I came back to Hawaii, that this case took on new dimensions for me, and I reshaped it now that I work no longer in an interdisciplinary ethnic studies program, but a history department. Joseph Kahahavai is actually buried at the base of Kamehameha Schools, just literally 150 feet from the bus stop where I used to wait for the bus to take me from Damien High School into town and then to other points beyond. If you take a look at his gravesite, you can see that aside from the fact that he's born on Christmas Day, it's a defiant moment talking about how he was killed and his life was cut short. In the bottom, you can't quite make it out, but later when other family members straighten the grave, it says ho'omanao, or to remember. So in recent years, more and more people have been remembering the history of the Massey Kahahavai case. It's only recently, in 2005, that David Stannard, who's in American Studies here and has a big book called The Massey Affair, he and I and Colby Black were actually consultants for Mark Zwanitzer who worked on this video from 2003 to 2005. This Massey Affair is now cast as an American experience in the US national imaginary. In the age of the internet, you can also intersect it with your students with other WGBH Boston curriculum materials and documentaries like the 1997 production of Hawaii's Last Queen, which takes a look at the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. We also have ways for students, and there are excellent guides, I must say, that I was a consultant for, that WGBH Boston put together, linking issues of race and the boundary between white women and men of color, and drawing parallels in the case of 1931-32 in Hawaii with that of the 1931 case of Scottsboro, Alabama. And for history buffs and people involved in legal dramas, there's also a way to talk about the persona and the biography of Clarence Darrow. So all of these different ways, toward the end of my book, I talk about these are new ways in which current generations of students are seeing the intersections between all these different kinds of histories or stories. I'm also well aware of things that are local and immediate, as I told you before. When I have worked at Kamehameha Schools, Kapaa Lama, I'll just show you what that craziness was about. This is me in the center. It's actually Halloween, so I actually decided to dress up as a Kamehameha Schools student who's slightly out of school uniform. You're not supposed to wear caps inside the building. I have an iPod, earphones on. But anyway, all of my other students are here. In the back, I think you can notice, you see some 20 US presidents, because I'm the AP US history teacher who's trying to drill them to make sure that they do well on their AP US history exam. Interestingly enough, my students were akamai, or smart, and they were always vamping in different ways on things, creating music or songs, or sometimes taking photos from their textbook. And in this case, these two individuals noticed that they looked almost exactly like some California-based Japanese Americans in the 1940s who were taking a look at a notice telling them to relocate. So I have my two students there say, wow, we look a whole lot like them. And I said, well, that's true because you're part Asian and you're also about of the same age, right? So these are ways in which students haphazardly try to relate to things, or at least they do so in order to impress their teacher, right? At the very end of the day, I was exhausted, as I'm sure you are now. Kamehameha Schools in the Kalihi-Palama area is on a hillside of 670 acres. It's the largest private school in America, or if you consider Hawaii part of America. Anyway, in the trails, there are trails above Alewa Heights that go all the way up to the Pali, the famous Pali Lookout. So my friend and I, who are avid runners, used to run up on these trails. Why am I telling you this? My wife always says, yeah, I'm hopelessly vain. But it's also the location, and this marker tells you, where Kamehameha School seniors in 1941 took their 22 rifles as part of the junior ROTC and went up into the hillsides in December 7th, December 8th, and December 9th to scout out in the Alewa Heights area to make sure that Japanese paratroopers had not landed on the Ko'olau Mountains. If you look really closely, you can see one of the names is actually Daniel Akaka, a World War II vet and one of our two current senators. Right after him is Henry Awana, and then Richard Kekuni Blaisdell, one of the founders of John Burns School of Medicine, one of my mentors, and also the namesake of my son, Luke Kekuni Iwao Rosa. So these are the ways in which, and a lot of my students and teachers are somehow related to these people. There are a lot of different ways in which we use actual physical sites, not just sacred sites, but even World War II sites to talk about things. There's a lesser known prisoner of war camp, for example, that held Italian soldiers on Kamehameha School's property that has been the subject of an archaeological dig. But even under that is a heiau, an agricultural temple from roughly 1300 or 1400 that a contemporary native Hawaiian mason by the name of Billy Mills spent over 3.5 years restructuring so that the school itself, ranging from preschool to kindergarten all the way up to high school, could use for future generations in talking about the history of Hawaii. Right here, they're planting kalo or taro, which has a variety of significance, which I can't really spend too much time here to go into. A lot of things are happening in Hawaii, and rather than close with a firm conclusion, very often I'm asked to talk here at the East-West Center for a Pearl Harbor group that talks about the landmark of Pearl Harbor and its importance. And slowly but surely, we've had John Osorio been able to talk about Pu'uloa or Pearl Harbor as a native Hawaiian space. And I'm brought in to talk about civilian experiences during World War II. If you take a look here, there's Red Hill. And in a spirit of openness with the military and information disclosure, we now know that Red Hill is actually the home to 10 large tanks of oil and gasoline that flow all the way to Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, in the Waianae coast, there are lots and lots of bunkers that are used for munitions, especially during the Cold War, that fund their way all the way to Pearl Harbor. This is the view from my campus apartment at Kamehameha Schools. I know about the layeredness of the history. I know the realism of it, and yet it's still pretty good sunset if you're looking west. Okay, we don't have much time, so here's the huaka'i, or tour, or field trip. I told you at the outset we're going to talk about Manoa to Waikiki. I haven't been talking about it directly, I've been talking about it obliquely. Weeks and weeks ago, and Professor Goldberg said, you know, maybe you could engage in a conversation. I thought about talking about APEC and this and that, and I thought, no, I'll just stick with things that I know. This is the island of Oahu, right? You can use technology to find these Landsat images in color that look like this. We're right here. Manoa Valley, Diamond Head, Waikiki. This is the airport. This is Pearl Harbor. Okay? So that's where we are. Always important to know where you are. This specifically is Manoa Valley, and this is actually an Enoch Perry painting at Bishop Museum. And this is an actual photo that I just took off the internet. So I think a lot of you are familiar with this scene. There's an ahupua'a system, which is the pie-shaped wedge, usually running from mountains all the way to the sea. That's very important, and is very much self-sustainable. You can live within an entire ahupua'a in a fish and poi economy, living off the fish that come from the ocean, sometimes from fish ponds at the seaside, and also live off the taro or the kalo that's grown in these valleys, or uala or maia'a, which are bananas and so forth. At the start is a very famous or well-known Manoa Falls. Anybody been to Manoa Falls? Did the hike? People go there all the time. Anyway, that's where the water comes from. It goes down through Manoa Stream, not too far from my house. Kolomona Ditch is actually just about 100 yards from my house. It's got invasive weeds, so on occasion, community groups, including study groups from UH, are involved in trying to plant native plants which do not grow as quickly and are a little different in not clogging up the stream. So if you want to take a look at these kinds of projects, sometimes I have my students take a look at the role of water in modern societies, how even community groups and school groups are involved in cleanup operations. Why are these cleanup operations good? Well, it's always good to clean up litter. But if you don't, when you have a lot of rainfall in Manoa Valley, you might have a flash flood like we had in 2006 that created a massive disaster for our Hamilton Library, causing millions of dollars of damage. This is a building that you see on your sign-in, right? This is the Eman Center, Japanese garden, also fed by the water in Manoa Stream. Once it goes past Dole Street, named after Sanford Dole, annexationist, first president of the Republic of Hawaii, it goes to Hawaiian Studies, and just last week you have Leeward junior high and high school students from West Oahu working in the kalolo'i, or the taro patch that's fed by Manoa Stream. If you continue onward, and I got this from Google Maps, the water goes all the way to that point A, which is where Manoa Stream dumps into the Alawai Canal, which was constructed in the 1920s by the Dillingham Corporation, which also dredged Pearl Harbor and became very, very wealthy. If you take a look at photos from this book by Gay Chan, who's the art chair here at UH, you can also see historical photographs like this one of the dredging of the Alawai Canal. Does anybody know what that area is up above? It's actually coral that's being used to fill up the swampland of parts of marshy Waikiki. Ala Moana Shopping Center, which is my next book. I'm going to take a look at the construction and utility of Ala Moana Shopping Center, which gets completed in 1959, same year as statehood, same year as the use of commercial jets, and the completion of the largest outdoor shopping center in the world at the time. Going back to Google, this is prime real estate, Waikiki, right? Why is water, fresh water. This area is spouting waters. It's very marshy, but the Alawai Canal actually drains it out into the Alawai Harbor. All of this area is reef here. If you take a look at web presences, Gay Chan and other scholars have innovative projects like Downwind Productions, taking a look at historic Waikiki, talking about the layers of history in places like Waikiki. You can take a look at Kaiser's, for example, which is a well-known surf break named after Henry J. Kaiser near Kaiser's Hilton Hawaiian Village. It's also the finished place for the Waikiki Rough Water Swim on Labor Day, which I'm training for. But anyway, the other section where the water finishes is Moana Bowls, which in the South Shore is pumping really well. Actually, we've had the first really good set in 5 years, and it's being chronicled here by Surfline Hawaii, which, if you are a contemporary surfer, is the global Bible of surfing and checking out surf sites, often through webcams, so that you don't have to drive down there or call a friend who's actually there. At Kaimana Beach, which is a very well-known beach, and some of you might have been to it, when you're swimming to the windsock, which is about 200 meters offshore, sometimes when you're trying to find your way back in, you're trying to navigate yourself between the natatorium, which is in honor of all of the people from Hawaii who fought during World War I. Oh my gosh, people from Hawaii are fighting in World War I. And also the new Otani Hotel. This is the windsock, about 200 meters offshore. Lesser known is the Trans-Pacific Cable that has linked Hawaii to the globe in 1903 onward until the beginnings of satellite communication. So I'm just about done. To make a long story short, what I do is I take a look at how these stories, how these histories become incorporated as part of another narrative, in some cases an American experience. They continue to evolve in a vibrant soup that I call the culture of history. I also like to close in saying that I got a call from my mother earlier today to help my grandmother cut the mango and lychee trees with my father at my grandmother's house where I grew up. Grandpa is no longer there, but my grandmother, I think and I hope, looks forward to my visits, and I suspect even more so to the visits of her great-grandchildren, my daughter May and my son Luke. So I'll end here with something that she often told me around about this time of day when I was living at her house. She told me, "You can only spend so much time indoors. Make sure to get outside and play a little." So thank you.